Scholar of International Relations in Africa. I don't know if everyone is aware, you may have come across this talk because of your interest in the Biden presidency or South Africa's stakes in that presidency, but the South African Institute of International Affairs runs regular events. We have gone online in the period of the COVID pandemic, and I would like to refer you to just a couple of events that will be coming up in the next few weeks. One is next Tuesday, the 13th of April. SIA National has a webinar planned on new investment pathways towards sustainable inclusive development. That webinar begins at 11 a.m. You can find information on the SIA website. The event is part of a series leading up to the high-level EU-Africa Green Investment Forum in Lisbon on 23 April 2021, and it's jointly hosted by the EU Portuguese presidency of the Council of the EU and the European Investment Bank. So that should be a worthwhile event. Also on the 13th of April, that afternoon at 2 p.m., SIA National hosts a webinar on African agency and Chinese power, the fine print. And there will be a panel of the world's leading experts on China-Africa relations, according to that invitation. And then finally, on the 29th of April, SIA Western Cape will run another webinar at 5 p.m. again, and we'll have Dr. Jan Urk, who will speak on the Ethiopian crisis, specifically looking to understand federal Ethiopia and the challenges of managing ethnic, religious, and linguistic diversity. I'm sure many of you have become aware of the crisis in Ethiopia. So hopefully those events will add interest to your calendar. And now I would like to introduce our speaker for the evening. Professor John Stremlau is Honorary Professor International Relations at Wits University in Johannesburg, where he has, in fact, in the past chaired or served as the head of the International Relations Department. In addition, in past work involvements, he has worked with the Carter Center, the Carnegie Commission on Preventing Deadly Conflict, the Policy Planning Unit at the US Department of State, and many other illustrious posts. Professor Stremlau is also widely published. The topic we will be listening to today, South Africa's stake in Biden's success. So I would like to encourage all of the participants to be submitting questions via the question and answer box and not the chat box. And we will be providing an opportunity for question time after we hear from Professor Stremlau. Okay, with that, I would just like to turn it over to you, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha, and greetings, everyone. I offer these remarks with some trepidation, I must say, because they are prepared as we all live under conditions unforeseen and not experienced before. This has been a year of isolation during the COVID-19 lockdown, so that COVID-19 not only disrupted our lives and nations, but challenged IR theories and practice. In the United States, 2020 was also a year of unprecedented politics. Never experienced a populist, ethno-nationalist president so willing to disregard the most basic principles and practices of a constitutional democracy, to ignore the facts and to appeal to the fears and bigotry, to advance his personal power and interests. At the same time, the persistence of racial injustice in the United States became a national and an international issue exemplified by George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter movement, which this week, Derek Chauvin, the Minneapolis police officer, is under trial for. So we're hearing more about that. I continue to be impressed by the amount of informed interest in the US politics in the South African media. I did over 200 interviews about the election with the media during the month of December. I decided to count up, and it is really quite remarkable how serious, compared to the US media, I think the South African media is on such issues. I assume that the audience I'm speaking to tonight is particularly well informed. So I look forward to your reactions as to whether the US is in fact at an inflection point, as Joe Biden and Kamala Harris intend, and if so, then what does this mean for South Africa? I also assume you are inundated with South African politics and may prefer me to focus more on the United States. So I hope that at least these few introductory comments and questions will prompt you to talk about South Africa's stakes in Biden's success at a time of profound changes in the role and ranking of states and international relations. I have organized my remarks with 5 aspects of this stress test that the US is under and that South Africa is under, actually. All begin with the letter C. The first is constitutional democracy. The second is COVID-19. The third is close, credible elections about core values. That's 1. And then the fourth is climate and other global challenges. And the 5th is China. My choice for the title, South Africa's Stake in Biden's Success, I'd say a few words with a few initial questions. What constitutes success? What are the goals and objectives Biden have set for himself and his administration, based mostly on his public statements and current affairs commentary that I've been following? Historians may indeed reach a different conclusion down the line, but I should not avoid talking about this now. I keep in mind, however, Arnold Toynbee, the famous historian's comment that he preferred to predict events after they happened rather than to try to talk about them contemporaneously. Secondly, South Africa's stake. So what questions you may have at the end of this talk, I have tried to view the significance of Biden's successes for South Africa from what I believe to be President Ramaphosa's perspective regarding South Africa's fundamental democratic values and interests. The choice of stake, not stakes, plural, is intentional, as I have sought to focus my opening remarks on what I believe is the overriding central concern driving the Biden presidency and the Ramaphosa presidency, but I don't attempt to defend the latter assertion. I will concentrate on the Biden presidency. Lots of stakes and interests exist between our two countries: economic, political, cultural, security. Mozambique today as I speak. We can discuss those in the question and answer period. I should also add that I am a partisan, both regarding both leaders and their parties, but I hope I am not blind to the strengths and the shortcomings of both, and my analysis is reasonable if a bit biased. Third, I have chosen to have Biden's success, not Biden-Harris. Linda Thomas Greenfield, who's now the new ambassador for Biden to the United Nations, who would have been ambassador to South Africa had Hillary Clinton been elected, by the way, and back in 2017. She speaks Biden-Harris, and everybody in Washington seems to talk Biden-Harris, which is appropriate. Kamala Harris is vital to what Biden is attempting, but as he studied and became Barack Obama's alter ego and successor, so too must she pursue a similar course of trying to put herself in her boss's shoes. So that raises the question, can a 78-year-old devout Roman Catholic Irish ethnic nationalist white guy lead the most progressive effort since Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s and Lyndon Johnson in the mid-1960s, but with a perilous partisan advantage that he has a very narrow legislative advantage compared to those two former Democratic presidents. And let's hope he doesn't run into the same kind of problems that they had run into in foreign policy during the course of their administrations. So despite this, Biden does appear at the moment to have the political winds at his advantage with the successful so far vaccine rollout. 4 million were inoculated on Saturday, and it's moving very quickly now. And a strong economic recovery in 21, 22 should gain him votes in the crucial congressional elections coming up only in 2022, just ahead of us. The stake I have in mind is fundamental. It relates to the inflection point that Biden and Harris appear determined to bend toward that long arc of history that Martin Luther King talked about, toward justice. American historians speak of 5 inflection points since the first, the nation's founding in 1789. The others include the Civil War and Reconstruction, women's suffrage in the 1920s, the New Deal's promise of citizenship, social citizenship in the 1930s, and civil rights movement of the 1960s. Is this a comparable tipping point or inflection point? It's too soon to know if Biden can accomplish that, but he appears to be determined to tip America toward racial justice, inclusion, and foster a sense of national unity of a particular type that has not been tried fully in America before. The American Declaration speaks of the inherent right of equality, but the Constitution sanctions slavery. And there is a long history of federal states' rights allowing electoral autocracies that we know in Africa to flourish in the southern states, one party with a strong populist leader. During the Civil War, Lincoln at Gettysburg in 1863 spoke of a new era of equality, of government by and for the people, a phrase that our Chief Justice here, Mogang, cited in a 2017 decision that related to Jacob Zuma's situation, by the way. Biden seeks equality among America's diverse identity groups. The same aspiration enshrined in the South African Constitution of 1996. A country united in diversity, in our diversity, will define the inflection point for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and by extension, Barack and Michelle Obama, by the way. That is the stake. A vision of constitutional democracy, I believe, is more modern than the equality of states vision of a more perfect union, more akin to the one enshrined in South Africa's constitution. In the next few minutes, I will attempt to relate this vision to the other 4 topics I briefly consider: COVID, close, credible elections, climate, and China. But first, constitutional democracy. The Biden campaign and presidency promised and is now carrying out policies aimed at fostering greater national unity, inclusiveness, and equality. Biden's concept of national unity reminds me of the provisions in South Africa's constitution, as I said. It respects and accords all of identities equally, none threatening, so long as none threaten the other, and we all respect the Constitution and rule of law. America differs from South Africa in that its majority of diverse ethnic identities comprises immigrants and their descendants. Descendants of slaves are different, having suffered 12 generations of oppression and several more generations of apartheid-like conditions that existed in the homelands. As in South Africa, Biden envisions strict non-racialism, a stark contrast to Trump's white supremacist strategy to make America great again for white America. Reforming the US Constitution in 1789 to promote and protect ethnic and other identities is not likely politically. Yet the Biden-Harris plan for the African diaspora, which I commend to you, it was a campaign document, offers important clues to how they would promote a more inclusive and diverse constitutional democracy through legislation, judicial review, and public education. Biden-Harris plan for the African diaspora offers access to health, education, employment opportunities linked to major initiatives such as the just passed and proposed deals for dealing with COVID-19 relief and economic recovery. Most interesting to me is its opening sections of the diaspora memorandum, celebrating the diverse ethnic, tribal, if you will, and national identities, much as Biden and I saw growing up in Northeast industrial towns with regard to diverse European ethnic identities that were all within the American framework then. In the case of the African diaspora, only 2% are recent immigrants. The rest are slave descendants. And the main beneficiaries of the legislation envisioned in the diaspora plan now top Biden's presidential agenda. But when the second impeachment of Donald Trump occurred, the representative from Colorado, Joe Neguzzi, a prominent member of that impeachment team, was identified as an Eritrean American, just as I introduced Joe Biden as an Irish American. An implicit reminder to me that the majority of African Americans, 11% of the nation, descend from slaves who mostly do not know their ethnic identities and hence must forge other meaningful identities, cultural, political, and otherwise, as most of us do as we integrate in larger and hopefully more fulfilling communities. Trump's tribalism, by the way, is a terrible throwback, but a potent one. Let me turn to COVID-19. A few words about the political fallout of COVID-19 catastrophe in the United States. This is not medical, public health, but politics. Had COVID not struck, Trump probably would have been, in my view, elected by an electoral college majority, claiming economic success and appealing to the Make America Great Again white voters, white ethnic nationalist voters. His long-term pollsters, Fabrizio Lee and Associates, published a post-election exit poll analysis for 10 key target states that determined the Electoral College outcome. Biden flipped 5, won by Trump and Pence in 2016. The main reason was white male voters and independents blamed Trump for his mismanagement of the COVID. Trump appears to have realized the rising health toll threatened his reelection, so he doubled down on his appeal to white nationalists. The GOP, the Republican Party, did not even bother to produce a party platform in 2020. It was, in fact, going to back 100% the populist leader, Donald Trump, for just that reason alone. In the event, Trump demagogued the results, never admitting to any COVID mismanagement, but saying that the election had been stolen, and you ask by whom, he would say African Americans who voted overwhelmingly for Biden as they had for Clinton and Obama. Indeed, they didn't vote in any larger proportion members. It was all the other votes that in these key states, Biden and Harris were able to convert that gave him the Electoral College win. Biden's COVID response strategy also seeks to promote unity by reducing inequality, by promoting social trust among the most affected and disadvantaged, who also happen to be people of color. Biden-Harris, in their $1.9 trillion COVID rescue and relief bill enacted in mid-March after a 51-50 Senate vote that is already nationally popular, despite the aim to foster inclusion, greater equality, and unity across racial, ethnic, and other disadvantaged identities. I think that's a function of the rollout vaccine at the same time, which benefits everyone. So Biden and Harris are being very clever as to how they're building this basis for greater national unity. Biden's latest COVID-19 related stimulus plan, the $2 trillion plus infrastructure, jobs, and climate bill, is also at the heart primarily to target disadvantaged members of the society while bridging the urban-rural divide. Its greatest impact on America's worst social ills promises to reduce racial disparities. This is also among his strongest voters, explain why the GOP is so opposed and hopes to be able to split off the white ethnic vote, but I'm more and more doubtful that they can succeed. Regarding South African interest in Biden's COVID response, as you may know, he immediately rejoined WHO, pledged $4 billion for COVAX, committed to restoring the Pandemic Early Warning and Response Office in the NSC that Obama had created after the Ebola crisis, and has efforts underway to restore capabilities for the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, as an important global resource in public health that doctors here in South Africa, public health officials, have relied on for years. US vaccine nationalism has been troubling to everyone outside of the United States, but it is bipartisan. And Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen on Monday called for speeding up the distribution of coronavirus vaccines to poorer nations. I expect this will be coming fairly soon because Biden knows it is important to get these vaccines out and spread to countries like South Africa and throughout Africa. Now, let me turn quickly to close, credible elections. The 2020 election was extremely close, not the popular vote, but the Electoral College, America's archaic Electoral College. Turnout was the highest in 120 years, and proportionally. The evidence shows that state authorities did their job credibly under extremely difficult conditions constituted by COVID. Throughout, Trump supporters still reject the results as fraudulent, but offer no proof. In the US, although Clinton won the national public vote by 3 million in 2016, she lost and conceded 306 to 232 in the Electoral College. But had 70,000 votes gone differently across 3 or 4 swing states, she would have won. And it is a safe bet fewer Americans would have died from COVID. 400,000 fewer, according to Deborah Bricks, who was a senior health spokesman during the Trump years, but a professional civil servant. Biden beat Trump by 7 million votes, but analysts agree that had just 42,000 votes gone differently in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, then Trump would have won. This is an argument for electoral reform, which I'll get to. Biden's Electoral College majority in 2020 was identical to Trump's in 2016. Biden currently leads a national effort to recover from Trump's unprecedented attacks on the most fundamental elements of any national democratic experiment: electoral integrity, the refusal to concede that Trump refused to concede, pressuring state officials to change the vote as he did toward the head of the election system in Georgia, abuse of judicial power to advance baseless claims of fraud, and most egregiously, instigating a violent assault against the nation's capital on January 6th to halt certification of Biden-Harris as the victors, which you're all aware of. The Republican Party's response has been to use their power in state legislatures in the last few weeks to table some 361 proposals in 47 states to make voting safer, in their terms, which Democrats call voter suppression, while the Democrats have tabled in their supporting states 843 ways to expand voting rights. This is a huge issue that will be, you'll hear a lot about in the months ahead. The New York Times analysis of the voting restrictions suggests they don't support very much, but Biden won that state by only 12,000 votes out of nearly 5 million. So keep your eye on 2022 and what the GOP may or may not be up to and how this voting rights legislation proceeds. US voting rights need reform and standardization, and the same is true in South Africa and across Africa. So this is a big subject. There could also be informal exchanges of views on elections across Africa in light of the African Union's norms enshrined in the Constitutive Act, and more specifically, operationally, in the African Charter for Democracy, Elections, and Governance. If the GOP succeeds in 2022 and Democrats believe it is the result of suppressing urban voters and a variant of state capture by white nationalists fearful of status, that could be a terrible example for Africa, South Africa, and would threaten the stability, I think, of America. If Biden succeeds in advancing voting rights for all citizens, regardless of race, this will resonate positively in Africa, the world's most ethnically diverse region committed to greater collective action and integration by peaceful, i.e. democratic means, internationally as well as nationally. Biden's commitments to multilateral cooperation and diplomacy are related positives for collective action in areas of national security and climate change. So let me talk briefly about climate change. Climate change has become a public concern, albeit not among the GOP or Republican elite. Biden has made it integral to his economic recovery strategy, linking it to job creation, education, reform, and racial justice. Climate change also is representative of a new cluster of global issues, along with COVID-19, such as food insecurity, biological warfare, and other threats. The Economist magazine recently referred to these concerns as not national security, but natural security. Princeton scholar John Eikenberry describes them as the crisis of modernity in our post-liberal global order. So this is becoming a subject of academic as well as policy debate. Biden views it as another opportunity, these global challenges, for development and for the basis of multilateral cooperation. South Africa here should also hope he succeeds. Biden-Harris, as you know, immediately rejoined the Paris Climate Accord, but no word yet on the Green Climate Fund, to which the US had pledged under Obama major financial support along with China. Biden-Harris also rejoined the WHO and pledged $4 billion to COVAX, as I mentioned. COVID remains his, and Cyril Ramaphosa's here, #1 priority. Efforts to restore the CDC as a leader in global public health and rebuild its pandemic and early warning response capabilities and renewed emphasis on science-based approach puts the US on a much better footing with South Africa. Biden-Harris's domestic focus on rebuilding the US economy more equitably emphasizes a Green New Deal across his strategy to build back better. This was evident in the $1.9 trillion Relief Rescue Act that I mentioned, and even more so in the infrastructure bill now being advanced through the legislative process. South Africa could engage the US constructively now and demonstrate that the community of democracies goes beyond Western allies. Immigration remains a major global issue, common concern for South Africa and the US with daunting challenges. But here too, sustained consultations and exchanges could be helpful. Finally, there is a cluster of issues best subsumed under artificial intelligence, the topic of a recently published 750-page national commission in the US with a host of recommendations that deserve South African academic attention and perhaps joint exploratory research. This is a good segue to my final topic, which is China. South Africa will make its own assessment about the Biden-Harris approach to China, but I want to highlight Biden's revealing comments during his March 25th press conference on foreign policy, which was his first. He was asked 3 questions regarding the U.S.-China relationship. One, would Biden maintain Trump's tariffs? 2, would banning of imports of forced labor products occur? 3, would cutting U.S. investment or China access to international payment systems be part of Biden's policies? Biden didn't answer immediately, and I'm going to spend my time on the response that he did give. He said that these were very important issues, but only reflected a tiny aspect of the US-China relationship, adding, I have known, I'm quoting Biden now, I have known and dealt with Xi Jinping a long time. I spent more time with him than any other world leader when he was Obama's vice president and Xi was vice president for Hu Jintao. Xi does not have a democratic small d, bone in his body, says Biden. But he's a smart guy. Like Putin, he thinks autocracy is the future. Democracy cannot function in an ever complex world. When Xi called his congratulations, I'm quoting Biden here, we talked for 2 hours. I said, we don't want confrontation, but steep competition, fair practice, trade. The US will invest more in science, renew its alliances, such as the Quad, Australia, India, Japan, the US, hold the Chinese accountable in Asia for things like Taiwan. He and I agreed that no leader can be sustained unless they represent the values of their nations. So no US president can ignore, nor will he ignore, the plight of the Uyghurs, the Muslim minority, Hong Kong, or Taiwan's democratic independence. Biden added, quote, to this questioner, I predict your children and grandchildren will be doing doctoral theses on issues of who succeeded, autocracy or democracy, because that is what is at stake, not just with China, this line between autocracy and democracy. Russia isn't talking about communism anymore, it's about autocracy. Command decisions in countries with strong leaders, not democratic institutions. That's what's at stake here. We have to prove democracy works. This is again in response to the questioner at his press conference. Implicitly, he was also speaking to the faction of Trump supporters in the United States who appear more willing to cast aside core rules and norms of democracy in order to win power under a populist leader willing to seize and wield power in a bid for state capture by a still powerful minority, the white majority barely, but just fast becoming a minority in the United States. Biden's success on this front should also relate to South Africa's values and interests. South Africa rightly maintains a positive working relationship with China, as demonstrated when it hosted the FOCAC China-Africa Cooperation Forum without compromising its own fundamental values. Having the US under Biden-Harris as an example of another ethnically diverse democracy offers the basis for experimenting with Africa-China-US mutually beneficial cooperation, in my view. What Biden did not dwell on, but should be obvious, is the fundamental difference between China and South Africa and Africa more generally, and the US. China is a civilization state that has evolved over millennia and is now nearly a mono-ethnic Han state. It represses the Uyghurs, and it seeks to unify fellow ethnic nationalists in Hong Kong and Taiwan, who may be more identified with democracy today than they are with their Han ancestry. But Xi shows little interest in dominating a diverse and unruly Africa. Rather, how do you get along? And I think this would be a theater of great experimentation for diplomacy in a complex world. Here are a few modest steps Biden and Harris could take with China, which Biden stressed could still be a partner if that suits both countries' interests. He could restart the Peace Corps and Fulbright scholars in China. He could let Confucian institutes operate without attacking. He could allow Chinese journalists back in Beijing. These are things that South Africa ought to pay attention to and see if he does. He could list visa restrictions on Chinese Communist Party members, and he could reopen the Houston consulate. He could seek a win-win-win tacit cooperation, which would benefit Africa. South Africa presumably does not want to be caught between the growing competition between the United States and China, but it should have the same proud independence that allowed friends with the US and smaller adversaries like Cuba, Libya, and Iran to flourish in the lexicon of South Africa's formerly good relations with all other countries. The US, according to Biden, simply can't afford that luxury right now because it's got to get its own house in order and make its foreign policy consistent with its own internal values. Let me conclude on ways forward and a few comments. I'll start with an anecdote. The late Kenyan American African and Islamic studies scholar, Professor Ali Masri, once told me when I asked him how he liked living in the United States. We had met first in Uganda back in '68. He said he thought of America as the world's first global nation, and that suited him very well. He then added that he thought South Africa could become the second global nation. Ali was an idealist, but he had no illusions. This was back in the 2000s, early 2000s. So before the era when left-wing populism, state capture, and exposures of corruption threatened South Africa's democratic experiment. And the right-wing populism, state capture, and corruption threatened America's democratic experiment under the Trump administration. Extreme inequalities persist in both nations. So do cadres of concerned Democrats with a small d. Biden has faults, as we all do, but shows empathy born of personal tragedies, deep faith in others other than himself, and a keen appreciation for the role, luck, and fate play in short, he's my kind of politician. And already he has achieved a remarkable amount in changing the tenor and substance of US politics for the better. With legislative achievements, executive actions, and appointments, the most diverse cabinet in history, and 11 new judges that include Asian and African American women, and the first Islamic federal judge. Susan Glazer in New York said Biden's ambition, in the New Yorker, said Biden's ambitions recall FDR in revitalizing US democracy and LBJ in civil rights and immigration reform, redressing inequality. Two transformative presidents with huge personal and political flaws, but they also had huge congressional majorities that empowered them, a cushion Biden currently lacks. By now, you should have a good idea of my take on South Africa's stake in Biden's successes. I know the average South African with knowledge of the US would say, isn't that belaboring the obvious? Biden is clearly better than Trump. But I have tried to dig a little deeper into the nature of South Africa's stake, reiterating why South Africa has a stake in Biden's success in sustaining his vision of a constitutional democracy in the United States. No democracy is perfect, but all are perfectible. I could envision a South Africa-US comparative project on electoral reforms. For example, as an example, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences has just released the findings of a bipartisan commission, quote, our common purpose, unquote, that comes up with 137 practical improvements, such as ranked voting, that would be worth discussing. And I know many here would be interested, as the Slabbert Commission and its revival and other initiatives suggest. Perhaps the African Union, too, as all African countries are now obligated under the African Charter to hold regular elections subject to international observation. I know of the limits and the disturbing number of electoral autocracies in Africa, but I think it's worth exploring, as my colleagues at the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa, ISA, based here in Johannesburg, are doing. Second, encourage closer academic cooperation around issues of current importance to overcoming inequality in our histories of racial injustice and adapting to the kinds of issues raised in this talk. The African Center for the Study of the United States at WITS is a promising start in this regard. Third, Biden's effort to tackle inequalities and social justice would have corporations pay their fair share in taxes, especially those that hide profits overseas. And that is very much in sync with the African Union ECA high-level panel on illicit financial flows that Thabo Mbeki chairs. And that's a promising area for joint inquiry. Fourth, AGOA is scheduled to expire in 2025, and research and analysis should be underway now, and in cooperation with the African Continental Free Trade Association, Free Trade Area Secretariat in Accra, and the South African Secretary General, Wamkele Mene, as they do relate to the sustainable democracy in South Africa, and the United States. A popular technical assistance program has begun following the Cold War and the end of apartheid have enjoyed bipartisan support. They were continued and sustained even during the Trump years. And I haven't spent time dwelling on them, but we could take questions on PEPFAR or Power Africa or Feed the Future and the other programs. One final thought. There is a Mandela thread running through the story that I've tried to sketch, starting with Obama's first political stand against South African apartheid as a student. He has become a lifelong student of South Africa's first democratically elected president, as his 2018 Mandela Centennial Lecture reminded us. It was also his first public lecture of his post-presidency, and he addressed it to Americans and to Democrats everywhere as well as his immediate audience. Biden, having spent 8 years as vice president trying his best to understand the thinking and priorities of his boss, has had a profound impact, in my view, on the Biden administration. And it is not a question of revisiting or redux of Obama administration, but he is trying his best to do better in the same spirit of that administration. There is, I believe, a hidden hand of Mandela's inspiring example at work here, but I will leave that thought for others to pursue or reject. Thank you very much, Martha, and I hope I haven't extended too long deadline. I think.
No, you're good. Thank you, John. Thank you very much. I want to extend a great thanks for your wide-ranging survey over the things that Biden is about. Your 5 C's I've made notes of. John, you're frozen. I'm just worried that we won't have you for question time. I will proceed and put questions to you and hope that we get connection back. In the meantime, I will thank the participants who have submitted questions. I see more questions coming. Great. John, do we have you? Can you say something?
No.
Okay, you're slightly frozen. Pippa, are you helping us with that?
Yeah, I think John's gone off, Martha.
Okay.
I'll try and get him back.
Okay. All right. I'll just read a few of the questions that perhaps, John, if the video is too much, you can just, if we lose you again, just try the voice. Okay.
I'm going to try to.
I think the idea of cutting your video is the best plan. So the questions that have come in, I think quite a few of them have actually been addressed by the comments that you've already made, but in the interest of just perhaps going a little bit deeper on some of these, and there are a few questions here that you have not addressed. For instance, there is a question about the next US ambassador to South Africa. Do you have any insight on when that appointment is likely to be made, and also on who is currently being suggested for that? I see that we've lost John again, so perhaps I should wait to put the questions. In the meantime, please do continue to send questions, and as John, there he is again. So John, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good.
I want the first question that I will put to you is a very straightforward one. It has to do with the appointment of a US ambassador to South Africa. As you would be aware, it took quite a couple of years for the last ambassador to be selected and then passed by the Senate, or approved by the Senate. Do you have any sense of when the likely date of a new appointment might be and who that might be? Have you had any background information on that?
No, but I'll say a couple of other words because I wrote a conversation piece about the first Biden State Department, and what he said then was very, very reassuring to Africa with regard to his commitments to diplomacy and to multilateralism, to the environmental concerns that are much priorities for South Africa. But the irony of your is that, or the questioner, is that I did know that Hillary Clinton was how she nations, and I think that Anthony Blinken and the State Department has got their hands full right now in lining up ambassadorial appointments, but the State Department itself is being revitalized and re-energized, and I think there'll be an effective partner in Swanee before too long, more so than it was the case during the Trump years.
Okay, thank you. So we still we'll have to watch that space. The rumors are not yet swirling about who that is likely to be. The next question is about AGOA. And I know you mentioned that would be a point you would like to cover if you'd had time. And the questioner asks, is this likely to be extended? Would you like to tackle that one?
I think it will be a subject for considerable discussion and negotiation. And it took a long time to negotiate AGOA. And I think that this is an urgent topic for South Africa to engage in. They probably already are. I'm just not current with what the government has underway with the new Biden administration. And I wasn't privy, obviously, to the conversation that Joe Biden had with Cyril Ramaphosa. But there is a desire on the part of the Congress to have more reciprocal trade agreements than unilateral concession agreements, and how it would be playing out. The Trump administration was doing bilateral ties. And the reason I suggested the African Continental Free Trade Area consultations was that this is a long-term and difficult process of integration going on in Africa. And it seems like the US should at least negotiate a future AGOA with a sensitivity to what are African priorities and concerns. They should not be held hostage to particular economic interests, but serve the broader concerns of integrating Africa more effectively into the global economy and advancing US-African trade and cooperation. I know that sounds very idealistic in general, but I think it's a mindset that is fundamentally different from the economic nationalism that was the Trump administration, and probably is more enlightened than the previous Democratic administrations as well.
Thanks, John. I do wonder if the fact that South Africa's economy shrank, I believe, by 7% in 2020, and that the economic outlook is not nearly as strong as the US economic outlook. I wonder if that will be factored into any future talks, but obviously that's all just speculation.
It is, but I could say a quick word that the U.S. is spending very, very heavily now, and there's going to be a sensitivity and a blowback reaction, probably politically as well as in the Congress, to the heavy expenditures that Biden is trying to get through his 51 vote majority in the Senate. But it does mean that the U.S. will be growing robustly and puts Africa in not a begging position, but in a let's negotiate about long-term partnerships and make this more fair. And that would be for some concessions by the U.S., especially for the poorer countries in Africa.
Okay. I wonder, sorry, I'm just looking at some of the other questions. Thank you, John. You did mention the tax proposals. In passing, you talked about the global corporate tax proposals, but I wonder if you could comment on what you think that will be like politically in the United States. In my reading of the recent passage of this large stimulus bill, that was the reconciliation package, a once-off opportunity to move through the Senate without that supermajority that's required for so much legislation going through the Senate. What do you think is going to happen with these tax proposals? And will that have an adverse, as you're saying, reaction in other areas such as foreign aid or in a more conciliatory approach to trade negotiations?
It's a very complex area, and I'm not an expert on it, but I do have a strong view that this is a priority, but it's also my view that it's a bipartisan interest. There are very few areas of bipartisan interest, as you know. Africa policy is one of them, and it's been consistent because of the foreign relations complexion of the committees in the House and in the Senate. But also, it is playing to a shared concern that does lie below the surface about the past injustices done to Africans and to African Americans in particular, that is still prevalent in the Hill despite all the hyper rhetoric and the appeal of the Trumpers to the white ethnic nationalists in the rank and file voters. So that I think in the case of the tax reform on corporations, there's also a bipartisan interest to see this money recovered. There will be strong pushback from the lobbyists, obviously, but I think you can get, as you've already seen, a bipartisan support for the being transparent on the origins of ownership of foreign companies that may be shell companies for hiding U.S. profits. There's a desire to get at these profits, and that's both Republicans and Democrats.
Okay, thanks. Now, just flipping things a bit, we've got a question about the influence, political, cultural, and strategic, of America in Africa today. The questioner states that he believes it's very low, arguably the lowest ever. What specifically might Biden-Harris do to fulfill Obama's broken promise to bring light to darkness? Those were his actual words. And I don't know if that has to do with the Power Africa initiative that was announced under Obama that seems to have hit low priority under Trump, or if it's talking about other aspects of the relationship. Can you, this is basically looking at Biden's policy to Africa and how to renew its influence here.
Well, a couple of obvious points. Biden is 78, as I said, a 78-year-old white Irish American, and therefore he has a freer hand to work with Africa than Barack Obama did. And don't forget the blowback that Obama's policies got from the Congress in going Republican in 2010, and then in this last election, Trump ran an ethnic nationalist campaign. The desire to transcend the old images of Africa. It seems to me to be quite real in Biden's case, but he is going to emphasize democracy, Martha, so that if he can have a partnership with African democracies, including South Africa, Ghana, others that are struggling to consolidate democratic experiments, I think that will be very much in his interest to do so, while at the same time realizing that things like climate change have to be addressed continentally. Things like economic integration are related to, to negotiating. And don't forget that within the African Union, the only concept they have of aggregation and integration is through democratic negotiations, through consensus building. So the processes of democracy are within states, not just within states, but also among states. And maybe there is some point to looking at the federal system in the United States as a future debating point, at least, for the federal or aggregating regional, sub-regional organizations in Africa. That's a long-term proposition that no one would take seriously right now, obviously. But I think there is some creativity that is possible here that is positive.
Okay, thanks. There's quite a long and involved question on China, which I will get to in a moment. But I want to put this one: how will the Biden administration likely approach regional conflicts driven by fundamentalist groups in Africa? He mentions West Africa, but also countries like Mozambique. And yeah, so that's a specific question about handling fundamentalist group-driven regional conflict. Can you comment on that?
Well, he sent his closest Senate colleague and fellow Delawarean to Ethiopia as his personal envoy, and is trying to figure out a way to work with others multilaterally in calming down the Ethiopian situation. And right next door in Mozambique, the special forces are present to try to counter the extremists that are in Palma and have caused such heartburn here and concern in South Africa, along with the French and with others who were formerly Portuguese, who are formerly imperialists, but maybe now are willing to at least lend a hand when there are security concerns that ought to be run by Africans for Africa. The test will be to look ahead in a more general sense, whether Biden will support the African Union's capacity to be stronger in its peacekeeping forces. And I think there is a good chance that he will, which Trump would not even entertain a question about. But it's still too early in the game to see. One thing you can say for sure, that Biden does not want to get sucked into regional conflicts in which America would be, as it was in Iraq, the lone ranger. And it is a sign of his intellectual and political growth that he feels that way, in my view, because in earlier days, he took a different position, but he learns.
Do you know if the US Special Forces in Mozambique were invited in by the Mozambican government, if they were already in the area as part of military exercises? How is it that they are so quickly there training?
There are these so-called lily pad bases throughout the arc of instability that, to my knowledge, are all at the invitation of the host government. I think the consultations began rather rapidly, and I'm not privy to any of them, but I would be really surprised, even though the Mozambican government was very reluctant to turn to international help. At a certain point, that help for logistical and other reasons became essential, and so I suspect that none of them are there without the agreement of the Mozambican government, and that this is not a neo-colonial adventure. It's a recognition that we're all in the same boat. The terrorism threat is something that is often rooted in local conditions, but is a global phenomenon that has to be countered because the African Union is against the use of violence in any means of political conflict, as we all know. And this is a case of violence being politically motivated.
Okay. I did see that ISIS claimed responsibility for the attack in Palma yesterday, I think. And maybe that would be part of the equation, I'm sure, for the US in their role there.
It will set off it will set off alarm bells in Washington, but it's at the same time maybe an exaggeration.
Okay. So this very complicated question on China, which I've tried to sort of distill the main essence from, really looks at China's motivations for being in Africa and whether the US will work with African states to, as they put it, counter the new age diplomacy across Africa, which looks up or which looks to national interests and not continental interests. And I think here is referring quite a lot to the bilateral trade arrangements that China tries to make with various African countries. And the end question is, can the US assist South Africa to stand up against China in Africa? With Biden's success, it is critical for South Africa. From a US standpoint, will South Africa ever stand up to China? So it's a bit of a circular question at the end.
It's a familiar question, Martha, and one that needs a lot of discussion. And I'm reluctant to sound too naive about this. But if you just look at the record of China in Africa, it has been deferential to local conditions. Maybe it's too deferential at times. It deals with whatever regime is in power. I don't think the Chinese have any designs on Africa that are threatening, but I think the Chinese are learning about how to get along to their own interests in Africa, and I think should be encouraged. I think it gives Africans choices, and that to have China involved in Africa and the US involved in Africa in ways that would be in the term that we used to use at the Carter Center when we had a project on this, and it was a different administration in Beijing than you have now under Xi Jinping, but nevertheless, it was a win-win-win. And the Chinese, in my experience at that time, that was 10 years ago, were prepared to work with the Americans if the Africans asked for that cooperation. And it has been shown in Southern Sudan and the Horn of Africa and piracy, in the West Coast issues of piracy. And frankly, on the grassroots level, I've seen it work well in complementary work in public health in Liberia when Linda Thomas Greenfield was the ambassador there. It's possible, but it does require a lot of goodwill and a lot of careful preparation and local responsiveness to African agency.
Okay, yeah. So we have a question going back to AGOA, which I think is a worthy question here. Given that AGOA was not a negotiated treaty, but rather unilateral legislation, as in it was passed in the United States, how would or should South Africa lead the effort to negotiate bilateral trade agreements without being accused of attempting to be a regional hegemon? So this really comes back to South African foreign policy, but in relation to the US AGOA.
Well, it's a very good question. It's a very good question, and it is a complicated subject, but it does beg for getting engaged with a discussion if the Biden administration is willing and they're properly staffed to do so. If that occurs, then what you want to do is to talk about how you have a framework agreement that is not just unilateral, that is to say, US legislation, which was very favorable to Africa because it was concessionary completely, but it had its particular bilateral rubbing points as chickens in South Africa, US relations became for the negotiations on the bilateral front. We need a new framework, and I think we need to begin to consult with the Secretariat of the Continental Free Trade Area, and also to talk among academics who are trying to figure out ways to think of freshly about the new possibilities of sub-regional and regional cooperation. I don't hate to be so general, but it really is a poignant moment of reflection and moving forward as a new administration struggles with this and as countries try to figure out what their relationship with China and the US is going to be in the future. And I think you need to have other trading partners as well talking about it through the channels which already exist regionally and sub-regionally.
Okay. I'm getting all kinds of information in the chat box, which I'm assuming everyone can read, about some of the different SIA policy briefings that also go into more detail on some of the things like AGOA and also the response to militant extremist groups. And so if you have an opportunity, just check out some of those materials at a later point. Now I've got a question that you might enjoy answering here, John, looking back at US politics, and that is, what do you believe will be Kamala Harris's legacy in her position as a vice president?
It's not only the question of her legacy as vice president, but whether she'll succeed Joe Biden either if he doesn't run in the next presidential election, or more likely in the following one, because she has enormous talent and does represent the new America, a diverse America, the America that Joe Biden envisions at 78 is a very much of a diverse one, and she's, as we know, a descendant of African Americans and Asian Americans, so immigrants. So let's hope that she clarifies, but it's too early to know, and it's also vulnerable to the surprises of a COVID, another pandemic, or a variant, or some other kind of issue. So you really can't. I admired Biden when someone asked him whether he was going to run again, and he said yes, that's his intention, but he wasn't prepared to think that far in advance. And unfortunately, in the political domain, you can't. Academics can, but politicians can't, and she's definitely a skilled politician.
Okay. It will be interesting to watch what projects she might pick up based on the things that she seemed to prioritize in her pre-election speeches. But yeah, that is difficult.
It's already given her the hot potato, which is the immigration question, and from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, which he was given by Barack Obama. So once again, it's important for everyone to realize how much a vice president in today's modern presidency, at least in the case of the Democrats, learns from the president, as Biden did from Barack Obama, and as Kamala Harris, I hope, will learn from Biden.
Okay, yeah. The questions that are coming in now sort of seem to circle back. There's quite a lot of interest in AGOA, John. And so they seem to be looking at the post-AGOA world, because there is an assumption, as you mentioned, that the reciprocity preferences will change this favorable trade arrangement. And so one of the questions is, does the US have new bilateral agreements with South Africa that aim at promoting South African business beyond AGOA? I don't know if you have seen signs through, say, Corporate Council for Africa or other initiatives that are looking to look at the post-AGOA setup. That I don't know if you have anything more to add there.
Well, I'm the wrong person to ask, except that I just reiterate my general view that this is a time of great creativity, but nothing is in cement yet. And so therefore, the sooner that you get these conversations going, the better for both sides. But the Biden administration is still very much in the process of making its appointments and dealing with COVID and the aftermath of that in terms of the economic recovery. I think the U.S., if it does recover, will be in a position where the Africans, if they have their agency and their demands are tabled in a way which are not just bilateral, but are SADC related and ECOWAS related and the East African Community related. But that's for African nations to begin to sort of say, how are we going to deal with the United States? And maybe they're already dealing with it. I'm just not privy to that.
Okay. One of the earlier questions, and I believe you did address the Biden Harris administration's early efforts to begin to reverse economic inequality in the US. But this questioner is one of the common threat to both the US and South Africa in their efforts to tackling social inequalities is economic inequality. Do you have any opinion on how the two countries could address this perennial problem? I don't know if the questioner is asking if they would do it to, as a joint effort, or if you see parallels between the effort that Biden has already made with his stimulus bill with South Africa's efforts at the moment. Do you have any further thing to say about that?
The obvious difference is that the American economy is far, far greater, and it's also the historic legacy that this was a country that was dominated by a white minority, and in the States it was a white majority. As I say, African Americans were only 11% of the population. But what is so striking about the Biden bills, both the immediate relief bill to COVID and now the infrastructure and jobs bill that is part of the larger recovery, is how much is targeted for the most disadvantaged. I think that if you have the conversation with a Biden administration that is on the move, South Africa has the point, which is just analytically sound. Democracy here is under enormous stress by virtue of the inequalities and the corruption that has to be redressed. And therefore, the US ought to be, if it really wants to have a partner in the South, it ought to be forthcoming, and it ought to be willing to undertake in concessionary ways important initiatives that could be a showcase for the sustainability of democracy in complex societies. The Ali Masri idea that you can't have a global nation that is respectful of all differences, whether racial or ethnic or religious, and still function effectively.
So this rather circles back to the big idea that you brought up at the beginning about this question that's hanging at the moment, and with a challenge between autocratic government and democratic government, and the Putins and the Chinese Xi coming out on the side of autocracy, and Biden obviously strongly advocating for democratic governance. That's, in that question about what to do about China, that's what he focused on, if I understood you correctly. So now, in our conversation before this webinar, you mentioned that you really saw one of the biggest stakes that South Africa has in seeing Biden succeed is in this question of democratic governance. Do you want to just maybe wrap up with a few more thoughts on that point?
Well, the point that I make about China all the time, and I'm happy to do it again, and I'm not a sinologist by any means, although I've been there many times, but I have not certainly studied Chinese, nor do I speak Chinese. But I am struck at how it is a civilization state. and it's gone through enormous domestic upheavals to become the kind of modern state that it is, and it's paid a very high price for that in terms of its own people's the abuse of those people and the Cultural Revolution and the like. I think they also are realistic enough to know that in Africa, which is the most ethnically complex region in the world, you really have to go with the flow, so to speak. And therefore, for a country that is like the United States, that is committed to democracy, the United States has an advantage in conversations because it's struggling with some of the same problems. The Chinese do not have the same ethnic diversity to overcome and to accommodate within the multiple identities that make modern life meaningful and successful for us, professional and as well as our family and more traditional identities, but also our civic identities as belonging to a democracy that gives us a certain amount of guarantees about the rule of law and freedom, but that is not corrupt, and it has got integrity, and its elections have integrity. So in the conversations between America and African democracies that are struggling to take care of legacies of inequality, I think there's a much richer conversation than could ever occur with the Chinese. But the Chinese at the same time can build infrastructure and do a lot of really good things in trade and economics, but they shouldn't exploit Africa any more than the United States should exploit Africa. There must be a way to move forward. And my last point on this, I think, Martha, is that there's nothing that focuses the mind like a common threat. And we've seen that in COVID. And we've seen the downside of vaccine nationalism, when in fact it's going to have to be solved by all of us together. It's a good reminder, and why I hope that Biden shares the vaccines. In the environmental field, we're going to see the same kind of question come up. In technology, there are going to be questions and that are transcending the traditional interstate relations. We need new paradigms, but they're going to come slowly. In the meantime, let's focus on the problems that confront us, like the Green Climate Fund needs to be revitalized for the sake of bringing Africa along with the rest of the world in dealing with climate change, even though Africa did not contribute to that pollution and environmental warming that is such bedeviling to the region that is most seriously affected by it. That argues for the compensation that is due to Africa, not because Africa is got its hand out for a handout, but because they've been unfairly treated. America is guilty of abusing its ancestors. We all come from Africa, and look what slavery and the history of racial injustice in America has led to in terms of that becoming a country that's so polarized and divided now in the 21st century. So we can find a way forward to heal these wounds, but it's going to be very difficult. And yet the kind of challenges that are on the horizon, like climate change, should focus on our need to act collectively in creative and new ways. Sorry to be so pontifical and general, but that's in a short webinar, Martha, that's the best I can do.
No, that's good. There's one last question. What happens to BRICS in the Biden era? Do you see any changes there?
I don't know, Martha. I'm struck that South Africa is the last man standing with regard to liberal democracy and the kind of illiberalism that, and maybe this should be my last point, that Freedom House has said, democracy is under siege globally, 15 years of recession, and look at the BRICS. You've got Modi in India, you've got Bolsonaro in Brazil, you've got Putin in Russia, Xi in China, and the last man standing is our dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, Cyril Ramaphosa. Okay.
I don't know the BRICS ever aspired to claiming democratic credentials so much as just economic influence, but it will be interesting to see if Biden is able to work with that formation for even in the economic sense.
Let me just add one quick thought, Martha, because the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, Haas and Charles Kupchan have just published a call for a concert of nations to help come to terms with the changing global scene that we've all been discussing here. And they call for a concert of nations with Japan, India, China, Russia, the United States, and the EU, freezing out other countries, but making it that they would run the world, or at least consult on how to have order. I think the community idea is more appealing, but it's more difficult to do. And I think that that concert idea probably won't be picked up immediately. We've got the United Nations after all. But I think formally you can talk about coming to grips with the common values that unite a South Africa and the United States in a more meaningful way, despite the fact that they're very different nations of different sizes, but they do share core values. At least I read that the Freedom Charter and the Constitution of South Africa seem to me to be symptomatic of the way the world is going. Should be going.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much. There are a few more comments worth noting in the chat box. Some of them from Elizabeth Sideropoulos, the director of the Institute, and one is looking or directing us to a book for those interested in the concept of a civilizational state that John is speaking about, an interesting book by Professor Zhang Weiwei from Fudan University is recommended. It's called The China Wave, Rise of the Civilizational State. So people can take a look at that if they would like more information. And I think that brings us to a close of our question time, really, John. I would like to thank you again for the thought you've put in and those 5 C's, and especially the idea that they actually each one represents a very big idea. Contested elections, that's a very big idea. Climate change as an example of the new cluster of sort of transnational challenges that face the globe, and the threats to constitutional democracy, what COVID brought, but also what it indicates in terms of our vulnerability as a global set of villages, as they would say, and what the mismanagement of that at a national level can mean politically, as it did for Donald Trump. And then finally, of course, China, the big question about China. And here we are at this juncture in US history that you mentioned, which seems to pose the question about whether democracy will survive in the United States, never mind in many other places where it is less taken for granted. So there is much to watch during the Biden administration and how those different elements play out. So with this, I thank you greatly for your input and also for your willingness to field questions. And I'm sure we'll be watching for some future publications from you where you unpack these things perhaps in a bit more detail as you're able to in a written work. And I want to also thank Pippa Siegel, who is in the background organizing as the host of this Zoom meeting, and also Ndumi from the national office, who is co-host and has helped us set this up. So without further ado, I will just say thank you very much, and I'll bring the meeting to a close, unless there is anything you'd like to just add as a final statement, John.
Thank you for giving me that opportunity, Martha. I just wanted to thank the questioners and to remind everybody that it would be a lot more fun to be meeting in person than Zooming, where we can't really interact and feel each other's chemistry. So let's hope that we get the vaccine soon and that we have a better meeting next time together. And thank you for the questions, and thank you for hosting it, Martha and Prisaya.
It's a pleasure. I also look forward to those back in-person meetings, and we will hope that that the new year 2022 brings much more of that. Thanks to everyone for participating and for your questions, and I wish you well for the evening. I'm going to close the meeting. Thank you.
Thanks, Martha.